more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
Well, welcome back to the Sense of Beer Style podcast. Hi, Julia. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And hi to you, Jeremy.
I'm really looking forward to this one. I've got my board shorts and my flip-flops on right now because today we're going to head to a tropical paradise to taste a beer that comes from that area. We are still on the British style stouts, but this one has a great story because as the export stouts traveled the world by ship back in the day, and trying to avoid pirates and big waves and weather, they found their way to the Caribbean in this example into Jamaica, and they loved the beer so much that they started making it themselves, but using their own endemic ingredients that we'll talk about in just a minute. And so therefore we get this beautiful beer style of a tropical stout. This one, I have to say, I'm not. Let me say this properly. Stout is not the first beer I reach for off the shelf, unless it's a tropical stout. The bad news is these are pretty hard to find, at least in our part of the world, in the western half of the U.S. They're not made a lot. This one that we're going to be talking about, Dragon Stout, is a great example. They're very common, more on the East Coast. These were sent to us by U.S. Beverage. Thank you very much for sharing these beautiful beers. But I did find these at a craft brewery in Oregon. It was the first time I found it. Falling Sky in Eugene had one called Dreadnought that was just beautiful. And I talked to the brewer about it, and it was inspired by a trip to Jamaica. And he thought, I need to make this at home, because when you're in the middle of winter, it's cold, maybe it's snowy, maybe it's rainy, we kind of need to take a trip to the tropics every once in a while. And this beer does that for me. So without further ado, let's dive in. Let's talk about the ingredients that makes this a tropical stout.
Absolutely. And big picture, if you're just joining us for Tropical Stout Beer Judge Certification Program 2021 Style Guidelines, is what Sense of Beer Style show follows. And it's basically a dark, sweet, fruity, somewhat strong, not too strong, some roast, not harsh kind of beer. And it's a lager. Holy crap, that's amazing. I'm blown away. And so history, basically it's a local adaptation of a foreign extra stout with some twists of ingredients. And those ingredients are going to take us to, right, like a sweet stout type of beer with pale, dark, roasted malts. And hops for bitterness, really no essence of flavor hops, and then adjuncts for sugar to boost it. That's part of the kind of Caribbean influence. And then that warm fermented lager yeast. So lagers traditionally like to be fermented at cooler temperatures. Most darker beers, I qualify it with most, or I should say many, are ales, but some are lagers. So when lager likes to ferment cooler and they ferment it in the Caribbean traditionally at warmer temperatures, that's probably just an ode to the geography of where the style was made. So characteristic ingredients are definitely going to include that essence of lager yeast, as opposed to what ale yeast would give us, which would bring some sometimes esters and sometimes phenols to the mix. And so with that, let's start diving into the beer. Jeremy, let's talk appearance.
Yeah, and if I can just tag on one little thing, I always forget that this is typically a lagered beer, or especially warm. So that, to me, that triggers that this is one of those hybrid beers, whether it's a ale yeast at cooler temps or lager yeast at warmer temps. We need to remember that this is one of those hybrids. And if anything, it is almost a twin to a Baltic porter, a cold weather lagered porter versus a warm weathered lagered stout. There's a lot of similarities there, and as far as the kind of the pedigree, I think I'm trying to say. I find that interesting. That makes this beer stand out for me. As far as color goes, this one's pretty simple and obvious. It's brown to black. We'll talk about the vital stats in a minute, but this is just brown to black. If you can see through it, it might be clear, it might be opaque. You need a thin glass to really tell for sure. And you should expect a kind of a tan, darker khaki colored foam with pretty good retention if it's poured well. If you're watching this on the screen, you can tell I don't have very good foam production on my glass. And that's probably just because I was trying to be gentle with it as I poured it. But typically, it's going to have a pretty good color of foam on the top of this. What about the aroma?
The aroma is one where I'm going to have a bone to pick a little bit with the style guidelines. It leads with moderate to high intensity. Sweetness is prominent. You cannot smell sweetness, Beer Judge Certification Program. You can't. Sweetness is a sense of basic taste. It's also going to be indicative, though, maybe of aroma and mouthfeel. So you're going to smell it and you're going to get a sense of, ooh, there's some girth, there's some dense, maybe residual sugars. That's kind of what they mean. But then you're going to get from those, pale and dark roasted malts and grains that's used in this beer, a sense of coffee, a sense of chocolate roasty aromas, that chocolate pudding that I like to refer to, maybe a little bit towards Dr. Pepper, could actually have some molasses or burnt sugar flavors, dried fruit, right? Dark dried fruit, and vinous aromatics. That's to indicate almost an essence of wine flavors. And that's going to come from some of the ethanol as well. So, you've got an essence of, if it's going to be one of the stronger ends of the style, a little bit of that ethanol when you smell it. And then low hop aroma is optional. I mentioned this style is not centric on the hops for flavor and aroma. It's more about the bitterness for hops, but it's optional. And then low diacetyl is optional. Diacetyl would give us in the aroma, maybe the flavor Jeremy will describe, a sense of low butter or butterscotch, but not aggressive. And so that will lead us to flavor.
And I love that you just said it gives like a sense of Dr. Pepper. That is, when you think about drinking Dr. Pepper, even though it's a sweet soda, it is a complex flavor profile that is really interesting. And I do get just a hint of that in this beer. This is a very malt forward beer. It's very sweet. It's very smooth. You get the dark grain flavor without the acrid, burnt, even smoky, ashy flavors. It is almost completely devoid of those from my experience. But it does have just that hint of roast. You got this sweetened coffee in cream flavor. You have this beautiful, not completely light milk chocolate, but a sweet, semi-dark chocolate in that flavor. The finish on this thing, it really does lean pretty far over to a sweet finish because that sweetness just lingers, and it's not overly sweet. It's not cloying. There are hops in the balance to keep it from getting too annoyingly sweet. So we have a medium low to medium bitterness as possible, but in this sample, this classic beer that we're drinking, I get a much lower bitterness out of that. You can get these wonderful esters though that come through a lot from the malts and through the fermentation program profile, I should say. It's a medium high esters. It's a sweet caramel. It can be a dark rum. Sometimes I get a little bit of like fried plantain out of this. Um, the hop flavor, if it's there, it's going to be low, but it's probably not going to be there most of the time because, again, this is all about the malt and the complexity. And again, you mentioned that diacetyl doesn't have to be there, but if it's there, it's totally okay. If you can detect it, you can enjoy it, but it should never be too much. This is a beer that is just full of complex flavor, but very much on the sweet side of it. If I were to brew something like this at home, I would probably want to use something like coconut sugar, maybe put some bananas in the mash. That's not typical of this style, but the flavors that I would get from those kind of conjured in how this beer is presenting itself. Um, and so it's just absolutely lovely. But because of all that body and all that sweetness, let's talk about the mouthfeel.
And I love that you did bring in with the style guidelines also talk about those dark rum flavors. It
Mm,
elicits that, and that area, the Caribbean, and the like. There
so good.
are so much influence from
Yeah.
rum, so it's a great aspect to think about in the flavor.
Yeah.
And then on mouthfeel, medium full to full body. I'd be hard pressed to say full body because to me, I'm thinking full body would be imperial stouts. Full body would be icebox, right? Full body would be beers with a little less carbonation, even. So, yeah, medium full to full body, but grain of salt there. And then
Mm,
smooth, creamy character. I definitely get that, but with a little prickle of carbonation. That carbonation moderate to moderately high. Actually, on my example, I'm not seeing the collar of foam that the appearance in the style
yeah.
guidelines
Me
calls
neither.
for, but I'm definitely getting moderately high carbonation, right? This is a springy, spriggy, sharper, brighter, almost dried out from the carbonation beer. So I do think the carbonation is a true aspect of the ingredients and the mouthfeel because it dries things out, and that's a fun one to have help it when the higher residual sugar is in existence. And then may have a warming, but not hot alcohol, as I indicated from also describing the aroma. And so, what styles is this close to? Because that will really help us in the
Yeah.
study of this.
It's really good to carve out, how this beer is different in relation to its neighbors. And so, the closest relative or closest neighbor to this one would be a sweet stout that we talked about in a different style cast. But this one is going to be a little bit stronger and a little bit more fruity, whereas the sweet stout or the milk stout is going to be more creamy. The tropical stout is similar to an imperial stout, but without that harsh bitterness, that harsh or harsher burnt flavors. It's going to be a little bit lower in alcohol. It's not going to be quite as boozy as that either. Yeah, we can compare it to an American stout. American stout really leans more toward the hops and the hop bitterness, as well as that acrid roasted flavors. This is going to be less hoppy, less burnt, and sweeter. Um, I think a really good comparison that was not really on the BJCP list, but if we're riffing on the stuff, this reminds me more of like a sweet London stout, but maybe a little bit stronger and maybe a little bit more. I don't want to say tropical fruit flavors because that's a little on the nose and that's not completely accurate. But you get more of that kind of dark rum, Myers rum type of flavor and feel out of this than you would a London Brown. That's really how we could differentiate this from other beers. Let's talk about the commercial examples since we're drinking one.
Absolutely. And again, thanks for the Dragon Stout. Since
Absolutely.
1920, the bottle indicates. I'm
Hmm.
also going to showcase the fact that this bottle is a little bit of a cutie. It's a smaller bottle, not your traditional 12-ounce or larger. This is 9.6 fluid ounces, is what I'm holding for this Dragon Stout. And I think that's an ode to the complexity, the depth of this beer, the not needing to drink as much volume per bottle or can that you would normally drink maybe for something that was a little bit lighter. So ode to Dragon Stout, loving it for sure. Classic examples, ABC Extra Stout, Lion Stout certainly comes up so often, Royal Extra Stout. You've got Bohemian Strong Black Stout. So the essence is a pride behind the fact that this is a really dark, um, tropical stout. And I mean, that's just the easy way when you're looking for a style example. And with that, Jeremy, what vitals would we really ground ourselves with this type of beer?
Sure, and when it comes to the numbers, the ones, if you're not studying for any Cicerone level test or BJCP test or beer sommelier test, just understanding that this beer is average to elevated in ABV. It's 5.5 to 8%. This one we're actually drinking now is 7.5, so it's well within range. It's a iconic classic example of. But the number range for those who are studying for those tests, the 5.5 to 8% is a very distinct uh, number that to my best memory only occurs in two different styles, and so it's easy to kind of memorize that because this one, another one, and you'll have to look it up. The IBUs in this, ironically, the IBUs can actually be from 30 to 50, so you can have this hop presence. Although I'm not tasting it in this sample, so but just understand that you can have a little bit of bitterness in there, but the focus should be on the malt and the sweetness. When it comes to the color, the SRM, we talked about it. It's brown to black, so that's 30 to 40. When we go to the EBC or the European Brewery Convention, we basically double that. We go 60 to 80, and we're still in that brown to black range. When we talk about original gravities, from the ABV is 5.5 to 8. That original gravity that puts us at 1056 to 1075, still kind of right in there. It's a good correlation to original gravity and ABV are a good correlation. And when we're talking about degrees Plato, that puts us at 14 to high 18 degrees Plato. For those of you who work with Plato. When we finally get to the final gravity, this is where it's really interesting. This beer has some body. You can taste it, you can feel it. And so, therefore, that final gravity can be a range of 1010 to 1018. So, this is, if it's all in the teens, if it's above 1010, it's got some body. When we get into degrees Plato, again, for you degrees Plato folks, this is going to finish up at 2.5 to 4.5. And round out overall when we're talking about amount of alcohol. If you're into Plato, that's going to be 11.5 to 14.3. If we're talking about carbonation, this is about average. I'd say 2.5. It isn't particularly overly carbonated, but if it's on cask, then it's completely different. But let's talk about the glass and the temp. This one's going to be interesting, I think.
Sure. And, if you research this style, you're not going to see a common type of glass. I today am and I've gotten used to tasting some of the beers when we do these shows in this kind of typical jelly or rocks glass because it's got a nice open mouth and it's for small amounts. So I would say that's a great one. You're going to see this served in a form of snifter, which you definitely see imperial stouts also served in. But I don't see this, especially with Dragon going with the 9 some odd ounce bottle in a 16-ounce glass, right? Your pint glass and the like. I would see this in a smaller glass, maybe a footed style snifter, or I say go with your jelly glass for sure.
Mhm.
I'd also say that serving temperature, I like stouts warmer. My classic trick is take 2, just because you can and life's short. Take 2, drink one right out of the fridge, watch it warm up, see how it performs. And that second one was out of the fridge from the time you pulled the first bottle out. And then it's warmer when you finally drink that second one. So going up to the high 40-degree Fahrenheit, up to even 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 Celsius, this beer is really going to display a lot more of that molasses, a lot more of that dark rum or Dr. Pepper and the like. And you're really going to start to see it showcase even further in the flavor arena.
To your point, the glass I think you're using is perfect. I'm using this fancy, not even a pint glass. It's just this kind of a tulip pint. But to your point, if we are drinking this in the tropics, this glass is going to be condensed and sweating from like the moment we pour it. It's going to warm up pretty fast, whether we hold it in our hand or not. So for me, the smaller the glass or the smaller the bottle, then that means we're going to consume it quicker so it doesn't get too warm, which is the risk in those conditions. So I think your glass is more appropriate in this situation.
Yeah,
Uh,
great
yeah.
addition. So what about pairing?
Ooh, pairings. I have done a little bit of research on this, but I'm just gonna stay tropical here. Obviously, this is a dark beer that does really well in the hot, humid, oceanic kind of environment to just sit back and enjoy. So with that, I want to have some Jamaica jerk chicken that is just savory and sweet and a tiny bit spicy. Would be fantastic with this. I used to eat grilled swordfish a lot, and it's just a very steaky type of fish. It'd be and very savory. It'd be fantastic with this. One of my favorite things I've ever had was on a trip to Belize. We had Belizean rice and beans, which is had this beautiful spice with chicken and fried plantains. And this beer would be perfect with that type of meal. I'm gonna plant my flag in the tropics and just stay there for a while. How about you?
Yeah, I love those suggestions. The depth and complexity of the malt flavors, I think, really merits a aged proteins, right? Heavier proteins if you are kind of a carnivore and go to that direction.
Hmm.
So aged meats are going to be richer and denser and more umami, and this will stand up to it and perform very well as a match and for those links and bridges and echoes back and forth with aged steaks, right? Aged beef, even aged lamb comes to mind, and served in a way that is going to showcase some maybe black peppers. A molasses reduction sauce comes to mind, all sorts of things to just the whole point of pairing is to elicit. And often one approach is not just a big contrast pairing, but like with like. And so think of a sauce that might have soy sauce, Worcestershire, that molasses reduction, and serve it with one of your tropical stouts. And I think you're going to be in home run land for sure.
Yeah, and this is just such a wonderful style. So if you find a tropical stout, because they're not that easy to find, if you find them, grab a few and take them home and try them, and brew it yourself, or talk to your craft brewers and say, I want more tropical stout, because I hate this word, but it is true. It is absolutely sublime.
Yeah, well said. Well, thank you for joining us for another Stylecast, Sense of Beer Style. Julia and Jeremy, your guides here and on the journey with you. Remember, you can watch us or listen. Always either have a beer in hand or listen to the show and then get all fired up to go get that beer and join us again. But thank you very much, and beer well. I guess that's a
Beer
new
well.
sign off.
That's a great tagline.
Yeah, beer well and good beers to you.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
And me, Jeremy.
tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.